It was a cold evening in New York, the kind that made the city lights shimmer against the frost in the air. People in elegant clothes stepped out of shining cars, their laughter and perfume mixing with the soft hum of engines. The doors of the Grand Belmont Hotel swung open again and again, letting in guests dressed in tuxedos and glittering gowns. Inside, a massive chandelier glowed above golden tables and waiters moved like clockwork, balancing trays of champagne. The night was meant to celebrate charity, luxury, and influence, and all hosted by the famous billionaire, Charles Donovan. Charles stood near the entrance, tall and confident, shaking hands with important guests. Every smile he gave seemed perfectly practiced, every word measured. He had built his empire on charm and power, and people adored him for it, or at least pretended to. But beneath his polished suit and practiced grin was a man who measured others by their wealth, not their worth. As the guests arrived, a small figure lingered outside the tall glass doors. A little boy, maybe 10 years old, stood shivering in worn-out clothes. His coat was too big for him, sleeves almost covering his hands, and his shoes had thin soles that did little to fight the cold. In his hand he held something wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, an old harmonica and a folded note. He watched the guests go in, his eyes wide, reflecting the golden light from inside. He had been standing there for almost an hour. People passed by, some with quick glances, others pretending not to see him. He wasn't asking for money or food. He just looked at the big piano that stood near the entrance, visible through the glass, its glossy black surface shining like a dream. The sound of laughter and music floated out every time the door opened. Finally, the boy gathered his courage. He stepped closer to the entrance and softly said to the doorman, "Excuse me, sir. Can I play that piano inside? Just once." The doorman looked at him in disbelief. "Play? Kid, this isn't a place for that. Go home." "I don't have one," the boy said quietly. "I just want to play one song, please." Before the doorman could reply, Charles Donovan himself approached. He had overheard the last few words and raised an eyebrow. The guests around him chuckled when they saw the small boy in front of the tall billionaire. Charles looked down at the boy, smirking. "You want to play my piano?" "Yes, sir," the boy said, his voice steady despite the cold. "Just one song. That's all?" The billionaire's laughter filled the air. "And why should I let you do that? This is a charity event, not a talent show." The guests nearby started whispering, some amused, some uncomfortable, but Charles, loving the attention, kept going. "Tell you what," he said, crossing his arms. "If you can really play something worth hearing, I'll let you in. Maybe I'll even take care of you, but if not, you walk away and stop bothering my guests. Deal?" A soft murmur went through the crowd. Some found his words cruel, but no one dared to speak against him. The boy hesitated for a moment, his fingers tightening around the old harmonica in his hand. Then he nodded. "Deal." The doorman shifted nervously. "Sir, I don't think—" "It's fine," Charles said with a smirk. "Let's have some entertainment." He gestured for the boy to come in. "Go ahead, little one. Show us what you've got." As the doors opened for him, the warm air of the ballroom hit his face. The light was blinding at first, so much gold and crystal everywhere. The sound of chatter and clinking glasses stopped as the guests noticed the boy walking in. He looked so small against the grandeur of the hall, like a shadow that didn't belong. The pianist, who had been playing soft background music, stopped mid-song, confused as Charles whispered something to him. A moment later, the boy was led to the grand piano, the same one he had been staring at for hours through the window. It was beautiful, polished to a shine, every key perfect. His small hands trembled as he reached out, almost afraid to touch it. The guests began to murmur again. Some rolled their eyes, others raised their phones to record. To them it was just another moment of amusement, a child trying to impress the rich. Charles leaned against a nearby table, arms crossed, clearly expecting a childish tune that would make everyone laugh. But the boy didn't rush. He placed his harmonica gently on top of the piano and took a deep breath. His eyes closed, and for a few seconds there was complete silence. Then, with a soft touch, he pressed the first key. The sound was fragile, uncertain. Then it grew. The melody began to flow like a whisper, simple but pure. His fingers moved slowly at first, then faster, finding confidence in each note. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy stillness. People turned toward him, drawn in by something they didn't expect. The boy's music carried emotion, sadness, hope, and something deeper that no one could quite name. Charles watched, his smile faltering for the first time. There was something familiar about the tune, though he couldn't place it. The longer the boy played, the more the noise of the ballroom disappeared. Waiters stopped walking. Conversations died mid-sentence. It was as if time had slowed down, and all that remained was the sound of that piano. When the boy finally lifted his hands, the last note lingered in the air like a sigh. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then stronger, filling the hall. Some people stood clapping with wet eyes. Others looked at each other, unsure what to say. The billionaire didn't clap. He just stared at the boy, lost in thought. The child looked up at him, unsure of what to expect. There was no pride in his expression, no arrogance, just quiet hope. "Did I do okay?" he asked softly. Charles opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The crowd waited, curious. The man who had mocked a child minutes ago now stood frozen, his face pale. Something in that melody had touched a place in him he thought no longer existed. Before he could respond, one of the guests whispered, "That piece. It sounds like something I've heard before." But the question hung in the air unanswered. The boy smiled faintly, picked up his harmonica, and whispered, "My mom taught me that song. She said it always brings warmth when people listen." He turned to the piano again and lightly touched the keys once more, the faintest echo of the melody still in his heart. No one laughed anymore. No one moved. The entire hall, once filled with noise, pride, and chatter, was now wrapped in the quiet truth of a child's music. And for the first time that night, Charles Donovan felt something he hadn't felt in years: humility. He looked at the boy standing before him, and though he didn't say it aloud, he knew something extraordinary had just happened. Outside, the city lights still glittered against the cold. But inside that grand hall, something warmer began to stir, something that money could never buy, and arrogance could never destroy. That was the night when a little boy, with nothing but a dream and a song, walked into a world that had forgotten kindness and reminded everyone, even a billionaire, what it meant to feel human again. The boy stood beside the piano, his small hands still trembling after the last note faded away. For a few long seconds, nobody said a word. The golden lights of the ballroom reflected off the shiny piano surface, and the air seemed heavy with something everyone could feel but couldn't explain. The same people who had laughed at him moments ago were now staring in silence. Some looked touched, some embarrassed. The quiet was almost louder than the music had been. The little boy lowered his eyes, unsure what would happen next. His heart was pounding in his chest, and for a moment he thought maybe he had done something wrong. He didn't know how to read the expressions around him. All he could see were unfamiliar faces staring at him with strange looks. Then a sound broke the silence. It was soft clapping. A woman near the front wiped her eyes and began to applaud. Soon others joined her. The clapping grew louder until the whole hall was filled with the sound of hands coming together. People stood up, some smiling, others with tears in their eyes. They weren't clapping out of pity. They were clapping because they had just witnessed something real, something that came straight from the heart. The boy gave a small smile, shy and uncertain. He didn't understand why they were cheering for him. He had played that same tune many times before, in the streets, under bridges, in quiet corners of the city, but never in front of people dressed in silk and gold. He looked around the room, hoping to find one friendly face, but most of the faces were still in disbelief. Then his eyes met the billionaire's. Charles Donovan was standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. The smirk that had once rested on his face was gone. He wasn't laughing anymore. For the first time that night, there was something human in his eyes, something like confusion mixed with a hint of guilt. He walked slowly toward the boy. The crowd fell quiet again, watching. Charles stopped near the piano and looked at the child. "Where did you learn that?" he asked in a low voice. The boy looked up, unsure whether to answer. "My mom taught me," he said softly, "before she got sick." The man blinked, and for a second he didn't seem to know what to say. "Your mother taught you that piece?" "Yes," the boy said, still clutching the edge of the piano as if afraid it might disappear. "She said music is like talking with your heart. You don't need to be rich to understand it." A few people in the room nodded quietly, and a soft murmur went through the crowd. Charles looked around at them, then back at the boy. His jaw tightened as though he was fighting something inside him. He cleared his throat and said, trying to sound composed, "You played well." "Better than I expected," the boy smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir." Charles turned to the audience, raising his hand slightly. "Well, everyone, looks like we've found some unexpected talent tonight." He forced a small laugh, trying to recover his usual confidence. "Let's give this young man another round of applause." People clapped again, though some of them exchanged looks that said they didn't appreciate how he tried to make light of what had just happened. The boy bowed slightly, though his eyes were still full of uncertainty. A waiter approached and handed the boy a glass of water, whispering, "You were amazing, kid." The boy took it with both hands and smiled politely. He hadn't had a kind word from a stranger in a long time. The billionaire leaned closer and said, "So, what's your name, son?" "Leo," the boy said softly. "Leo," Charles repeated, tasting the name as if it meant something. "Do you live around here?" The boy hesitated. "Not really. I stay where I can. Sometimes the park, sometimes a shelter." The murmurs grew again. Guests whispered to one another. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked sympathetic. Charles's expression darkened slightly, as if he wished the boy hadn't said that aloud. He forced another smile. "Well, Leo, it seems luck brought you to the right place tonight. You've just played in front of some of the most influential people in the city." Leo nodded politely but didn't seem to understand what that meant. He was still looking around the room, amazed by the gold decorations, the shiny glasses, and the food he had never seen before. Everything looked too perfect to be real. Charles sighed and said, "All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your evening. The performance is over." He gestured toward the boy. "We'll make sure he gets something to eat." A few people smiled at that, though others looked uneasy at how casually he dismissed the moment. Still, Charles ordered a waiter to bring the boy some food. Leo sat quietly near a corner table while people went back to talking and laughing, though the mood wasn't quite the same anymore. Something about that child had changed the room. The waiter placed a plate in front of him, roasted chicken, bread, and a glass of juice. Leo looked at it as if it were treasure. He whispered, "Thank you," and started eating slowly, afraid it might be taken away. Each bite felt warm, comforting, and had a rare feeling in his life. From a distance, Charles watched him. The more he looked, the less he could ignore the strange feeling in his chest. The boy reminded him of something or someone in from long ago. That tune, that calm determination in Leo's eyes, even the way he touched the piano keys. It all tugged at something buried deep within him. After a while, Charles walked over and sat across from the boy. "So, Leo," he said, his tone quieter now, "you really love playing the piano, don't you?" The boy nodded. "It's the only thing that feels right. When I play, I don't feel hungry or cold. I just feel close to my mom again." Charles looked down at the table. For a moment, his usual sharpness was gone. He remembered his own childhood, the one he never spoke of. The small apartment, the broken piano his mother had tried to keep for him. The way music had once filled their evenings before success replaced it with silence. "You said your mother was sick," Charles said softly. "What happened to her?" Leo looked away. "She got worse last winter. I tried to get help, but she—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "She told me to keep playing. She said people would hear someday." Charles didn't speak for a long time. Around them, the music started again, but the sound felt distant. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "She said people would hear someday." After a while, Charles stood and signaled to one of his assistants. "Find out where the nearest children's shelter is," he said quietly. "Make sure they know about this boy." Leo looked up, confused. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Charles said quickly. "You did something right. I just think you shouldn't be sleeping outside anymore." The boy smiled faintly, though he wasn't sure if he believed him. People had made promises before. Kind words that turned to nothing when the night ended. "Still," he said, "Thank you, sir." Charles nodded, trying to hide the guilt in his eyes. He turned to leave, but stopped when the boy said, "Can I play one more song? Just one?" Charles hesitated. The crowd was talking again, but curiosity pulled him back. "Go ahead," he said after a pause. "Play one more." Leo walked back to the piano. The room grew quiet again. This time his fingers moved with more confidence, more heart. The melody was slower, softer, filled with warmth instead of sorrow. People stopped eating. their conversations fading as the sound spread through the hall. Even Charles closed his eyes for a moment. When the last note ended, the crowd erupted in applause once more. But this time, Charles didn't join in right away. He stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes distant. Something inside him had shifted, something he hadn't felt in years. Leo stood, bowed slightly, and looked at him with a small, hopeful smile. "Did you like it?" he asked. Charles took a deep breath, nodded, and said quietly, "Yes, Leo, I did." The boy smiled wider, his eyes bright under the golden light. For the first time that night, the billionaire didn't see a beggar or a lost child. He saw a spark, something pure, something he couldn't buy with all his money. As the night went on, people left the ballroom still talking about the mysterious boy who played like an angel. None of them knew his story, but all of them would remember that sound. And for Charles Donovan, the man who thought he had seen everything, that night marked the beginning of something he never expected, the quiet awakening of a heart that had long been asleep. The next morning, the city woke up to its usual rhythm. The rush of cars, the sound of footsteps, the buzz of 1,000 lives moving in a hurry. But for one little boy, that morning felt different. Leo opened his eyes to the sound of birds instead of the street noise he was used to. For a second, he didn't remember where he was. Then he saw the soft blanket around him, the clean pillow under his head, and the smell of fresh bread coming from nearby. He sat up quickly, blinking in surprise. He wasn't on the cold pavement or the wooden bench he had slept on for weeks. He was in a small guest room with white curtains and a window that let in the morning light. On the chair beside the bed was a folded note and a clean shirt. He picked up the note and read the short message written in neat handwriting. "Eat something and don't leave until we talk." "CD?" Leo smiled softly. For a moment he wondered if it had all been a dream. The big ballroom, the piano, the people clapping for him. But then he remembered the sound of the applause, the warmth in the billionaire's eyes, and he knew it had been real. He changed into the clean shirt, which was a little big on him, and walked out of the room. The hall smelled of coffee and toast. In the dining area, Charles Donovan sat at a table with a cup of coffee in his hand, reading a newspaper. His suit was perfect as always, but there was something different about him that morning. A quiet look in his eyes, as if he hadn't slept much. When he saw Leo standing there shyly, he set the paper aside. "Good morning, Leo," he said. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, sir," Leo replied, his voice polite and careful. "Thank you for letting me stay." Charles nodded toward the table. "Sit down. You should eat." There was a plate waiting, warm toast, scrambled eggs, and a small bowl of fruit. Leo sat down slowly and began eating, taking small bites as if afraid the food might disappear. Charles watched him in silence for a while, his mind turning over thoughts he couldn't quite put into words. After a few minutes, he said quietly, "You play very well. That wasn't just luck. You have real talent." Leo looked up, his eyes shining with quiet pride. "Thank you, sir. My mom used to say music was our way of talking to the world." Charles stirred his coffee and nodded. "Your mother must have been very special." "She was," Leo said softly. "She always said music could heal anything. Even sadness." There was a long pause. Something in those words touched the billionaire more deeply than he expected. He looked at the boy again, the same boy he had mocked just last night, and felt a strange mix of guilt and admiration. "Leo," he said finally, "I meant what I said last night. You shouldn't be out there alone. I'd like to help you." The boy looked up, uncertain. "Help me how?" "I could make sure you have a place to stay, food, school, and maybe piano lessons if you'd like. You have a gift and it shouldn't go to waste." Leo blinked as if trying to understand. "You mean, you'd take me in?" Charles hesitated. The words felt heavier than he expected. "For now, let's say I'll make sure you're safe. We'll see what happens next." The boy smiled shyly, but there was a hint of disbelief in his eyes. "People say nice things like that sometimes," he said honestly. "But they don't always mean it." Charles leaned forward slightly. "I mean it." For a few seconds, they just looked at each other, a man who had everything but felt empty, and a boy who had nothing but still carried hope. Something unspoken passed between them. Later that day, Charles took Leo with him to his office. It was a tall glass building overlooking the city, filled with people in suits and polished shoes. Everyone looked surprised when they saw the boy walking beside their boss. Secretaries whispered to one another, and even the security guard raised an eyebrow. Charles didn't explain much. He simply said, "He's with me." And that was enough to silence everyone. In his office, Leo stood by the window, staring at the skyline. "It looks like the stars are hiding inside the buildings," he said quietly. Charles smiled faintly. "You've got a way with words." "I just see things how they are," Leo said. The man sat behind his desk and studied the boy. There was something refreshing about his honesty. No pretending, no fear of saying the wrong thing. Just truth, simple and clear. He picked up the phone and made a few calls to a music academy, a lawyer, and a social worker. He didn't know why he was doing all of this so quickly, but something inside told him it was right. While Charles worked, Leo explored the office. He found a small piano in the corner. A decorative one, not meant for serious playing, but it caught his attention immediately. He sat on the stool and pressed a few keys. The sound was soft and slightly out of tune, but he smiled anyway. Charles looked up from his papers. "You can play if you want," Leo hesitated. "Here?" "Of course." So he began to play again, softly at first, then with more feeling. The notes filled the office like sunlight, bright and gentle. People walking by stopped at the glass walls to listen. Secretaries peeked in, their faces softening as they heard the melody. Even the phone on Charles's desk stopped ringing, as if the world itself was listening. When Leo finished, there was silence again, the kind of silence that made you forget to breathe. Charles leaned back in his chair and said, "You do that and the whole world stops." Leo smiled shyly. "It's just music." "No," Charles said quietly. "It's more than that." That afternoon, Charles took Leo to a nearby music academy. The building was old but full of life, with the sound of violins, guitars, and pianos echoing through the halls. The head teacher, an older man with silver hair, greeted them warmly. "This young man has a talent I haven't seen in years," Charles said. "I'd like him to study here." The teacher raised an eyebrow. "May I hear him play?" Leo nodded nervously and sat down at the nearest piano. His fingers touched the keys and the room seemed to change again. Even the students practicing nearby paused to listen. When he finished, the teacher smiled, deeply moved. "Remarkable," he said softly. "His technique is raw, but his emotion, that cannot be taught." Charles felt a quiet pride rise inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked at the boy and said, "We'll arrange for you to start soon." Leo's eyes widened. "Really, I can learn here?" "Yes," Charles said with a smile. "You can." For the rest of the day, they walked through the city together. The boy talked about his mother, about how she used to play in small cafes and teach children for free. He said she always believed that music could change people, even the coldest hearts. Charles listened, feeling the truth of those words settle deep inside him. As the sun began to set, they stopped at a park near the water. Leo looked at the skyline and said quietly, "I think she'd be happy right now." Charles looked down at him. "Why's that?" "Because someone finally heard her song," Leo said. "She used to say the right person would hear it one day." The man didn't answer. He just watched the boy's face, and full of innocence, strength, and something rare in the world he lived in: faith. That night, when they returned to the mansion, Charles stood for a long time by the window after Leo went to bed. The city lights glowed far below, but his thoughts were somewhere else. He kept hearing that melody in his head, the one that had silenced the ballroom. He finally realized what it was that bothered him so much about it. The tune wasn't unfamiliar. He had heard it once years ago from his own piano teacher, the same woman who had taught him before he became the man the world knew today. She used to play that same melody, calling it a song of hope. Now it lived in the hands of a little boy who had nothing but heart. And as Charles stood there in the quiet of his grand house, he understood something he hadn't in years. Maybe this meeting wasn't just coincidence. Maybe it was a second chance for both of them. The following evening, the city lights shimmered through the tall windows of the Donovan mansion. The world outside was busy and loud, but inside the grand house there was a strange calm. Leo sat at the piano in the large living room, his small hands moving slowly over the keys. He wasn't playing for applause this time. He was just playing for himself, softly, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there anymore. The gentle tune floated through the quiet hallways, mixing with the soft crackle of the fireplace. Charles Donovan stood a few feet away, watching. The boy seemed completely lost in the music, eyes closed, head slightly tilted as though every note carried a memory. There was something pure about it, something that made Charles feel like a child again, back when he used to dream instead of calculate. He didn't say a word, afraid that even breathing too loudly might break the spell. When the song ended, Leo lifted his fingers slowly, as if the piano still held the last bit of his heart. He turned to find Charles watching him. "Sorry," he said quickly, almost embarrassed. "I didn't mean to bother you. I just wanted to practice." Charles shook his head. "You didn't bother me, Leo. That was beautiful." The boy smiled shyly. "It helps me think." "About what?" "About my mom," Leo said softly. "She used to tell me that music can reach people even when words can't. Sometimes I feel like when I play, she can still hear me." Charles didn't respond right away. He sat down in the chair near the piano, his face thoughtful. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Leo said proudly. "She always said that kindness is music too. You just have to listen to it." Charles felt something tighten in his chest. He looked at the boy for a long moment before saying, "Leo, I need to ask you something. Last night, the song you played at the gala, did your mother teach you that?" Leo nodded. "Yes, she said it wasn't really hers, though. She learned it from someone else a long time ago. She said it was a special song that came from her teacher." Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Did she ever tell you her teacher's name?" The boy frowned, trying to remember. "She said her teacher's name was Elena Marlowe." The sound of that name hit Charles like a stone. He froze. For a few seconds, he couldn't speak. That name had been buried deep in his memory, a name he hadn't said out loud in years. Elena Marlowe had been his piano teacher when he was young, long before he became a billionaire, long before fame replaced peace in his life. Charles stood up slowly, walking toward the window. "Elena Marlowe," he whispered. His voice trembled slightly, something rare for a man like him. "She taught me too a very long time ago." Leo's eyes widened. "You knew her?" "Yes," Charles said quietly. "She was the one who taught me everything I know about music. About life, really. She used to say that music without feeling was just noise." Leo smiled sadly. "That's what my mom used to say too." Charles turned to face him, his voice softer now. "Leo, your mother, and what was her name?" The boy looked down at his hands. "Her name was Anna." Charles closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered now. Elena used to talk about a young student she adored. A little girl named Anna who had the purest heart and most natural gift for music she had ever seen. Charles hadn't thought about it in years, but now the pieces began to fit together. He took a deep breath and said, "Your mother was Elena's student. That means she learned that song from the same person who taught me." Leo looked at him curiously. "So we both learned from her music?" "Yes," Charles said softly. "In a way, she connected us long before we ever met." The boy smiled, though his eyes glistened. "Mom used to say that music finds people who need it." For a long moment, the room was quiet except for the sound of the fire crackling. The connection between them, the once arrogant billionaire and the orphaned boy, felt real now. It wasn't charity anymore. It was something deeper. Later that evening, Charles went to his study and pulled out an old wooden box from a shelf. Inside were a few yellowed pages of sheet music, a photograph of a smiling woman at a piano, and a letter written in elegant handwriting. The sight of it brought a lump to his throat. He carried the box back to the living room where Leo was still at the piano, softly practicing scales. "Leo," he said quietly, setting the box down beside him, "I want to show you something." Leo looked at the photograph and gasped. "That's her," he said, pointing. "That's my mom's teacher. She had that same picture in one of her old books." Charles smiled faintly. "That's Elena. She taught me when I was just a little older than you." He unfolded the letter and handed it to the boy. "She wrote this to me before she passed away. I never shared it with anyone." Leo held the letter carefully and began to read the neat, flowing handwriting aloud. "To my dear student Charles, if you are reading this, then time has already taken me far away. But I want you to remember what I told you long ago, that music is not about perfect notes, but about truth. Someday someone will come into your life and remind you what that truth sounds like. When that happens, listen. Let your heart remember what your mind has forgotten." When Leo finished reading, he looked up, his eyes wide and full of emotion. "She was talking about this, wasn't she?" Charles nodded slowly. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years his eyes filled with tears. "Yes," he said softly. "I think she was." Leo didn't know what to say, so he did the only thing that ever felt right to him. He began to play. The same song that had brought them together at the gala. The same song that connected their lives to the same teacher. The same melody of hope. As he played, Charles sat beside the piano, closing his eyes. Every note carried him back to the dusty old studio where Elena had once corrected his posture, where she told him to play with heart instead of pride. He had forgotten what that felt like until now. When the last note faded, Leo turned to him and said quietly, "I think she'd be happy that you heard it again." Charles smiled through the tears he didn't bother to hide anymore. "Yes, Leo, she would." They sat there for a long while, neither speaking, just letting the quiet fill the room. For Charles, it felt like a lifetime of walls were finally beginning to crumble. The arrogance, the loneliness, the hollow victories, all of it started to fade. In its place grew something unfamiliar but warm: humility, gratitude, and peace. That night, before going to bed, Leo stopped at the door of Charles's study. "Sir," he said softly. "Yes, Leo? Thank you for listening to me play. I know people like you don't have time for kids like me." Charles turned from his desk and smiled gently. "You're wrong about that. People like me should make time. I just forgot that for a while." Leo smiled, then added, "I think your teacher would be proud of you too." Charles looked down at the letter again and nodded. "I hope so." When the boy went to bed, the house was quiet again. But this time it wasn't an empty quiet, and it was peaceful. Charles sat by the fireplace for a long time, thinking about the strange way life worked. He had spent years chasing things that didn't matter, only to find meaning in the most unexpected place. Through the music of a boy who reminded him what it meant to feel human. Before turning in, he opened his old notebook and began to write for the first time in years. He wrote a new piece of music, one inspired by the boy's melody and his teacher's words. He titled it Second Chances. As he wrote the last note, he whispered softly to the empty room, "Thank you, Elena. I finally heard it." And somewhere in the distance, the soft sound of a piano echoed from Leo's room, gentle, hopeful, and full of heart. It was the sound of two lives healing at once, joined by one song that never truly ended. The next few days brought quiet changes to the Donovan mansion. The same grand hallways and tall mirrors still gleamed with wealth, but something in the air had shifted. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps anymore. It was music. Real, living music that came from a small boy with big dreams and an old piano that finally felt alive again. Leo had grown comfortable in the mansion, though he still moved carefully, always afraid of taking up too much space. He would wake up early every morning, tiptoe down the hall, and sit by the piano before breakfast. The sunlight would pour through, the windows touching the ivory keys, and he would begin to play. The housemaids had stopped dusting that room when he was practicing. They said the air felt too sacred to interrupt. Charles Donovan, the man who once scoffed at charity and emotion, now started his mornings listening quietly from the doorway. He no longer rushed to meetings or barked orders into phones. Instead, he stood there, a cup of coffee in his hand, eyes soft, as Leo's music filled the house. One morning, as the notes drifted through the air, Charles walked in and said, "You know, you play better every day." Leo smiled shyly. "I just practice what I feel. The piano listens, so I try to talk to it." Charles chuckled. "That's something my teacher used to say too. She said a piano is like a mirror. It shows what's inside your heart." Leo nodded thoughtfully. "Then I guess that's why some songs sound sad even when they're not." Charles sat down beside him on the piano bench. "Do you know what you're playing right now?" Leo shook his head. "It just came to me." Charles listened carefully. "It's beautiful. You should write it down before you forget." The boy looked surprised. "Me? Write music?" "Of course," Charles said with a small smile. "Every great musician starts with something small. A song is a story, and you have one to tell." That day they began working together. Charles showed him how to write notes on a staff, how to mark tempo, how to build melody. It was strange for Charles at first. It had been years since he sat down at a piano with someone else. But the boy's energy, his innocence, his curiosity, it all felt like a breath of life he didn't know he needed. Soon, the house wasn't just filled with music, but with laughter. Leo would sometimes make mistakes on purpose just to make Charles laugh, and Charles would pretend to be angry but couldn't hide his smile. One afternoon, while they were working on Leo's first song, Charles's phone began to buzz. He frowned when he saw the name flashing on the screen, a business associate from New York. "Excuse me, Leo," he said, stepping out of the room. Leo stayed seated, his small hands frozen above the keys, listening to the muffled voice from the hallway. He couldn't make out the words, but he could tell by Charles's tone that it wasn't a happy call. When Charles returned, his face was tense again, the way it used to be before Leo came. "Is everything okay?" the boy asked. Charles sighed. "It's business, Leo. Sometimes people forget that money isn't everything." Leo looked down at the piano. "Mom used to say people who chase money too much forget the sound of peace." Charles gave him a tired smile. "She was right. I've been one of those people for a long time." For a moment, they both sat in silence. Then Leo said softly, "Do you ever miss who you were before you got rich?" The question caught Charles off guard. He turned to the boy, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I do, but I think I'm trying to remember that person again." Leo smiled gently. "Then maybe the music is helping." Charles reached over and ruffled the boy's hair. "You know, Leo, you're wiser than most adults I've met." Leo giggled. "That's what my mom used to tell me too." The following week, Charles received an invitation to another high society gala, the kind he used to attend every month. It was a charity event for children's education, and ironically, it was hosted at the same venue where he had first met Leo. The memory of that night returned sharply. The crowd, the laughter, the arrogance. He remembered his own cruel words, and it made him wince. That evening, while sitting by the fire, he asked Leo, "Would you like to go somewhere with me this weekend?" Leo looked up from his sheet music. "Where?" "To a place where I think people need to hear your music again." The boy blinked. "Another fancy party?" Charles nodded. "Yes, but this time it'll be different." Leo hesitated. "Will they laugh at me again?" Charles shook his head firmly. "Not this time, and if they do, they'll have to answer to me." Leo's eyes lit up with a small, brave smile. "Then I'll play." The night of the event arrived with shimmering lights and the soft hum of luxury cars. The grand hall was filled with people in suits and gowns, holding glasses of champagne, talking about profits and projects. Charles walked in beside Leo, who wore a simple white shirt and a black vest. He looked small next to the glittering crowd, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. When people saw Charles enter with a boy instead of his usual guests, whispers began to spread. Some of them recognized Leo. "Isn't that the boy from the last gala?" one woman murmured. "The one who played the piano?" Charles ignored the whispers. He placed a comforting hand on Leo's shoulder and guided him toward the stage. "Just like before," he said softly. "Only this time, play what's inside your heart." Leo took a deep breath, sat at the grand piano, and closed his eyes. The hall fell silent. The first notes came out soft and uncertain, but soon they grew stronger, brighter. He wasn't playing someone else's song this time. He was playing his own. Every note carried his story. The hunger, the loneliness, the kindness of a stranger, the rediscovered friendship through music. It was raw and real, and for the first time in a long while, the crowd didn't know what to say. As Leo played, Charles stood at the side of the stage, his chest swelling with pride. He could see it, the way people's faces changed. Their expressions softened, their arrogance faded. The music reached them, stripped them of the coldness that wealth often built around their hearts. When the last note lingered in the air, the hall remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to rise to their feet. The applause started softly but grew louder, echoing off the marble walls. Leo looked up, stunned as the room filled with the sound of clapping hands and admiring faces. Charles stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "this young man reminded me what real talent looks like, and what real humanity sounds like. You see, I once mocked him. I once failed to see the beauty in his gift, but tonight he reminded me of everything I had forgotten." He paused, his voice steady but emotional. "This boy isn't just a pianist. He's a reminder that greatness doesn't wear expensive clothes or walk through red carpets. It lives in the hearts of those who play from the soul." The applause grew even louder. Some people even had tears in their eyes. Reporters were already taking pictures, their flashes lighting up the room. But for Leo, none of it mattered. He looked only at Charles, and in that look was something more than gratitude. It was trust. After the performance, people crowded around the stage, praising Leo, shaking his hand, and asking where he had learned to play. But Leo, with his simple, honest nature, only said, "My mom taught me, and now Mr. Donovan helps me remember her." Charles felt his throat tighten. It was the first time he'd been called something more than "sir" by the boy. It felt like family. That night, as they drove back to the mansion, the city lights glimmered across the windshield. Leo leaned against the car window, looking tired but happy. "Did I do okay?" he asked softly. Charles smiled. "You did more than okay, Leo. You changed people tonight." Leo smiled faintly. "Maybe they'll be kinder now." "I think they will," Charles said. "You showed them what kindness sounds like." Leo yawned and nodded. "Music is kindness with sound," he murmured before his eyes closed. Charles looked at him, this boy who had walked into his life with nothing but a song, and whispered, "You've done more for me than I could ever do for you." As the car drove through the quiet streets, the stars shimmered above, silent witnesses to the strange, beautiful friendship between a man who had lost his heart and a boy who helped him find it again through the power of music. The mansion, lights appeared in the distance, glowing warmly, not as a symbol of wealth anymore, but as a home. The morning after the gala, the Donovan mansion felt alive in a way it never had before. The sun spilled through the tall windows, lighting up the golden frames and polished floors. But the real light was in the air, in the music that came from the grand piano in the living room. Leo sat there again, his fingers dancing across the keys, creating a melody so full of hope it could have lifted the heaviest heart. Charles stood in the doorway, watching quietly. He had been awake since dawn, unable to sleep after what had happened the night before, the image of the crowd standing in awe, the sound of applause, and the look on Leo's face, that pure mix of pride and disbelief. It all played in his mind again and again. When Leo finished, he turned and smiled shyly. "You're up early," he said. Charles chuckled. "Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts. Good ones or bad ones?" Leo asked. "Good ones," Charles said softly. "For once." He walked over and sat beside the boy. "Leo, do you realize what you did last night?" "You changed people. You changed me." Leo shrugged lightly. "I just played what I felt, and that's exactly what made it powerful," Charles said. "You reminded everyone what real music sounds like, what real heart sounds like." The boy looked down. "Mom used to say that sometimes the smallest song can reach the biggest hearts." Charles smiled. She was right. They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them thinking about the journey that had brought them here, from that humiliating night when Charles had mocked the little boy, to now when he felt proud to call him family. After breakfast, the house phone rang. It was the same event organizer from the gala. She wanted to speak to Charles. "I just wanted to say," her voice came through the receiver, "your young pianist has become the talk of the city. Everyone wants to know who he is. A few schools and foundations have reached out. They'd like to offer him scholarships and training." Charles smiled. "That's wonderful. I'll tell him." When he shared the news with Leo, the boy's eyes widened. "They want me to study music?" "They do," Charles said proudly. "They think you have real talent." "And they're right." Leo hesitated. "But what about you? I don't want to leave here. I like playing for you." Charles placed a hand on his shoulder. "And I'll always want to hear you play. But this is your chance, Leo. You can learn from the best, play on real stages, and make your mother proud." This is what she would have wanted. Leo didn't answer right away. He looked down at the piano, tracing the edge of the keys with his fingers. "I'll miss this place," he whispered. "It feels like home now." Charles's chest tightened at those words. He hadn't realized how deeply the boy had become part of his life. "You'll always have a home here, Leo," he said quietly. "This house will always be yours too." The days that followed were filled with preparation. Applications, interviews, letters, all the things Leo had never imagined doing. But through it all, he still spent every evening at the piano, sometimes with Charles beside him, sometimes alone. The songs he played changed too. They weren't sad anymore. They were full of courage and hope. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Leo looked at Charles and asked, "Do you ever wish you had followed music instead of business?" Charles thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," he admitted. "I was too proud back then. I thought success was about having more than everyone else. But now I know. Success is about what you give, not what you take." Leo smiled. "Then I think you found it now." Charles looked at him. "Because of you, Leo. You reminded me what matters." On Leo's last night before leaving for the academy, Charles organized a small gathering at the mansion. Not a grand party, just a few close friends, the house staff, and a few musicians he had reconnected with after years. The living room glowed with soft candlelight, and the piano stood at the center. When Leo sat down to play, everyone fell silent. The first song was one he had written himself, a simple melody that told his story. Each note seemed to hold a memory: the cold nights on the street, the taste of hunger, the pain of losing his mother, the sound of laughter in the Donovan mansion, and the joy of being understood. When he finished, the room was filled with quiet tears and gentle applause. Even the usually stern butler wiped his eyes. Charles stepped forward, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I used to think I had everything," he said, "but I didn't know what real wealth was until I met this boy. He reminded me that music, kindness, and connection, these are the things that make life worth living." Leo looked up at him, his small smile trembling. "You gave me a home," he said softly. Charles shook his head. "No, Leo, you gave me one." After the guests left, the house fell quiet again. Charles and Leo sat by the fireplace just like they had on that first night. The boy leaned his head on Charles's arm, and for a while they said nothing. The silence was comfortable, filled with warmth. Finally, Leo spoke. "Do you think my mom can hear me when I play?" Charles nodded slowly. "I think she hears every note. And I think she's very proud of you." Leo smiled through his sleepy eyes. "I hope so." The next morning, the car was waiting by the gate. The sky was golden with sunrise. Leo stood by the piano one last time, touching the keys gently. "I'll be back," he whispered. Charles walked over, holding an envelope. "Before you go," he said, "I want you to have this." Inside was a sheet of music. At the top, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Second Chances," the song Charles had written after hearing Leo play for the first time in his house. "It's for you," Charles said. "Maybe someday you can finish it." Leo held it close, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you. For everything." Charles knelt down to meet his eyes. "No, Leo. Thank you for reminding me how to feel again." As the car drove away, Charles stood by the gate, watching until it disappeared down the road. The house behind him felt strangely quiet again, but not empty. It felt full of music, memories, and love. Weeks passed. The letters began to arrive, short, simple notes from Leo. "I played at the Academy concert today. Everyone liked my song. We learned about famous composers. I think you'd like them. I started teaching a younger student. She's shy but brave." Each letter made Charles smile. He framed the first one and placed it near the piano. Months later, one crisp autumn evening, Charles returned home to find a thick envelope on his desk. Inside was a program booklet and a handwritten note. "Mr. Donovan, we invite you to attend the winter concert at the National Music Academy. Our youngest performer will debut his first original composition." At the bottom was Leo's signature and a small drawing of a piano. Charles felt his throat tighten. Without hesitation, he booked the next train. The concert hall was grand and filled with families and teachers. When Leo stepped onto the stage, taller now and wearing a neat black suit, Charles felt a swell of pride that no amount of business success could ever match. When Leo began to play, Charles recognized the first few notes. It was Second Chances. But then Leo added his own melody, blending it with Charles's song. The music rose and fell like a story, filled with life, love, and gratitude. By the time the last note faded, the hall erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Leo stood, bowed, and looked out into the crowd, his eyes finding Charles's instantly. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not money, not fame, not reputation. Only the connection between two souls who had found each other through music. After the concert, they met backstage. Leo ran to him, grinning. "Did you hear it?" "I finished your song." Charles smiled, tears glimmering in his eyes. "You didn't just finish it, Leo. You made it perfect." They stood there for a moment, the sound of applause still echoing faintly behind them. Then Charles said, "Your mother would be proud." Leo nodded, looking up. "I think she already knows." Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky, and the winter air carried the faint echo of music from the hall. For Charles, it was the sound of peace, the sound of a promise kept, a lesson learned, and a life forever changed by a little boy who had once asked, "Can I play for food?" Now the boy played for the world, and the man who had once mocked him could only smile, knowing that somewhere in every note lived the sound of redemption and love.